A millionaire anxiously awaits a crucial call from an investor who promised to save his company from financial collapse. When he steps out for an emergency meeting, the phone rings and his cleaner's 8-year-old daughter, a sharp girl from the outskirts, boldly answers and says, "Never call my boss again." When he returns and catches the last seconds of the conversation, he is left in complete shock. The Thursday air was heavy, a hot, humid mass that clung to the skin and made every breath a chore. Inside Sal's auto and repair, the smell of burnt oil and hot metal mingled with the sweat of the mechanics, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere. Arthur Montenegro felt the collar of his imported linen shirt stick to his neck, a clammy sensation that fed the fury simmering in his chest. His black Mercedes, a masterpiece of German engineering, was dead, a silent monument to his impotence. For over an hour, he had watched 3 men in grease-stained coveralls hunch over the open engine, their tools clinking with an ineffectiveness that wounded his pride. Every lost minute was another broken link in the chain of control he had meticulously built around his life. A crucial meeting was unraveling in some air-conditioned skyscraper, and here he was, trapped in this purgatory of vulgar smells and sounds. Frustration was a bitter taste in his mouth, a reminder that all his money couldn't bend the laws of physics or, it seemed, human incompetence. He looked at the mechanic's calloused hands and felt a profound contempt. They were hands that built, yes, but crudely, without the elegance and precision of a well-negotiated contract or a successful hostile takeover. He saw in them a reflection of a world he had left behind, a world of limitations his financial empire was supposed to have insulated him from forever. The anger, however, was just a convenient mask for the pain that gnawed at him from within. The stalled car was a mirror of his own life, sophisticated on the outside, but with something fundamentally broken on the inside, something even he didn't know how to fix. A brief glimpse of his daughter, Clara's face, flashed through his mind, the look of disappointment on her last birthday, when he'd cancelled their celebration to close a deal in Tokyo. That same look of breakage, of an essential piece that had come loose and been lost. He shook his head, swatting the memory away like an annoying fly. Weakness was not an option. "Well," his voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a scalpel, "do you intend to stare at this junk heap all day, or are you actually going to do something to justify the absurd amount you'll be charging me?" Sal, the owner of the garage, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of grease. "Mr. Montenegro, with all due respect, we've never seen anything like this. The diagnostics show nothing. It's like the car just decided to quit." Arthur let out a humorless laugh. "Decided? Machines don't decide, my friend. People fail, and you are failing spectacularly." It was at that exact moment, as his arrogance peaked and contempt poisoned his every word, that a small figure materialized by the car's fender. It was a girl, maybe 8 years old, with tangled hair and a dress that had once been colorful, now faded and stained. Her feet were bare, covered in a thin layer of street grime. She wasn't looking at him, but at the complex tapestry of wires and parts in the engine, her large, serious eyes scanning each component with a focus that belied her fragile appearance. For an instant, time seemed to stop. The clatter of tools ceased. The girl lifted her gaze, fixing it directly on Arthur. A deep stillness settled in her eyes, a wisdom that didn't belong to her age. Then, in a voice so quiet it could barely be heard over the distant hum of traffic, she whispered the words that would change everything. "Sir, I know how to fix your car." A shocked silence lasted for a second before being shattered by a loud laugh from one of the younger mechanics. The laughter spread like wildfire, infecting the other waiting customers. Sal tried to suppress a smile but failed. Arthur's humiliation, already unbearable, found a new target. He saw in the girl the perfect opportunity to deflect attention from his own vulnerability. With a cruel smirk, he turned to the small audience, projecting his voice so everyone could hear his joke. "Did you hear that? The little genius is going to save us." He leaned toward the child, scorn dripping from every syllable. "All right, let's make a deal. You fix my car, and I'll adopt you." The garage erupted in even louder laughter, the sound echoing cruelly as the girl remained still, impassive, her gaze still fixed on the engine that defied them all. The sound of laughter echoed off the garage's metal walls, a wave of scorn that seemed to solidify the hot air. Arthur felt like the conductor of this cruel orchestra, and for a brief moment, he savored the power of turning a child's humiliation into his own relief. But the girl didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the car's silent, metallic heart, as if the noise around her were merely the buzzing of distant insects. Her indifference was more unsettling than any tear. Slowly, as if in her own world, she held out a small, grimy hand towards Sal, the garage owner, who was still wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. Her voice, still a whisper, but now filled with an inexplicable authority, cut through the remaining mockery. "I need a screwdriver with a magnetic tip, 7 millimeters. The specificity of the request silenced the last of the laughter. Sal blinked, surprise replacing the humor on his face. He glanced at his assistants, who shrugged, equally bewildered, but there was something in the girl's posture, in the seriousness of her gaze, that compelled him to obey. He rummaged through his toolbox and, with visible hesitation, handed her the requested tool. Arthur watched, a cynical smile still playing on his lips, awaiting the punchline. The kid could barely hold the tool properly. This was going to be delicious. The girl, however, moved with a grace and precision that contradicted her appearance. Her small, nimble fingers found a path through the tangle of wires and hoses, a place the grown men hadn't considered. She didn't seem to be looking. She seemed to be feeling. She leaned over the engine, her hair falling across her face, and a soft metallic sound was heard, an almost imperceptible click, then another. She pulled back, placed the screwdriver carefully on the ground, and with the same unearthly calm, looked up at Arthur. "You can start it now." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the expectation of everyone present. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. It was absurd, impossible, but he was a man who never backed down from a challenge, especially one he had proposed himself. With slow, deliberate steps, he walked to the driver's side door, the feeling of dozens of eyes on his back. He sank into the soft leather, the familiar scent of luxury calming him for a moment. He inserted the key into the ignition, his heart beating a strange, uncomfortable rhythm against his ribs. He turned it. The engine roared to life instantly, a deep, powerful and perfect sound, filling the garage with the vibration of its restored health. No one clapped, no one spoke. The sound of the engine was the only judge in this makeshift courtroom, and its verdict was undeniable. The girl had been right. The professionals had been wrong, and he, Arthur Montenegro, the titan of industry, had been made the biggest fool of all. He cut the engine, and the silence that returned was 10 times heavier than before. It was a silence of shock, of embarrassment, and for Arthur, of a humiliation so profound it nearly left him breathless. Slowly, he got out of the car. All eyes were pinned on him, waiting. What would he do now? His promise, made in jest, hung in the air like a sentence. "You fix my car, and I'll adopt you." The words echoed in his mind. The girl watched him, her large, serious eyes holding no triumph, no expectation. There was only a quiet stillness. She wanted nothing from him. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she simply turned around. On her bare, dusty feet, she began to walk toward the garage exit, away from the miracle she had just performed, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She was leaving him alone with the weight of his ridiculous promise and the shame of his exposed cruelty. "Wait!" The word escaped Arthur's lips before he could stop it, a raw, strange sound in the stunned silence of the garage. The girl stopped at the threshold, her back to him, a small silhouette against the blinding afternoon light. She didn't turn, but her stillness was an answer. All eyes shifted to Arthur, curiosity replacing shock. That single cry had committed him, turning an embarrassing situation into a public spectacle of which he was now the undisputed star. Pride, the armor that had protected him for decades, was cracked, and beneath it, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable was stirring. It wasn't compassion, he told himself, it was a matter of image. He couldn't be seen as the man who humiliated a child and then simply drove away. With a sharp gesture, he pulled his wallet from his pocket, extracting a thick wad of cash. It was his solution for everything: money. A clean, efficient transaction. He would pay for the service generously, and the episode would be closed. "Kid, this is for your work." He walked toward her, his hand outstretched, the money a barrier between them. He expected her to turn, for her eyes to widen at the amount, for a grateful smile to erase the memory of the humiliation. But she didn't move. When he was close enough to touch her, she finally turned, but her gaze didn't go to the money. It went to his face, and in those deep, serious eyes, he saw neither gratitude nor anger. He saw something far worse: pity, as if she knew that wad of cash was all he had to offer. Without a single word, she shook her head, a subtle but definitive gesture. And then she was gone, disappearing onto the busy sidewalk, swallowed by the city's anonymous crowd. Arthur stood frozen, his hand still extended, holding money that suddenly felt dirty, useless. The internal laughter of scorn he had heard before was now directed at himself. He, the master negotiator who could buy and sell companies with a phone call, had just been rejected by a barefoot child. The humiliation burned hotter than before, driven by a force he didn't understand, a mix of anger, wounded pride, and a spark of genuine curiosity. He shoved the money back into his pocket and stormed out of the garage, ignoring the bewildered looks from Sal and the others. He spotted her half a block away, a small figure moving with surprising agility between the legs of pedestrians. He followed, keeping a safe distance, feeling ridiculous in his expensive suit as he tailed a street kid. Where could she be going? A home? An orphanage? With every step, the city he dominated from his panoramic office windows transformed. He noticed the grime on the sidewalks, the tired faces of the people, the smell of street food mingling with exhaust fumes. This was the real world, a place he had worked hard to forget. The girl turned down a narrower street, then into a dark, foul-smelling alley between two old buildings. Arthur hesitated at the entrance. This was not his world, but the need to understand, to regain control of the situation, pushed him forward. The alley was a corridor of shadows, the air thick with the smell of damp garbage. At the far end, where daylight barely reached, he saw her. She wasn't going to a door or meeting anyone. She stopped beside a large, rusted dumpster. There, in a small recess in the brick wall, was her shelter. A piece of cardboard on the ground served as a bed. Beside it, a worn-out teddy bear with a missing eye stood guard. Arthur stopped, the air knocked from his lungs. This wasn't just a poor girl. This was a child living alone in this filthy hole, the weight of his words in the garage. "You fix my car, and I'll adopt you," crashed down on him with the force of an avalanche. No longer a joke, but the cruelest of ironies. Arthur remained frozen at the alley's entrance, a displaced figure in his designer suit, watching the scene unfold in the dim light. The girl, whose name he didn't even know, moved with a familiarity that was heartbreaking. She straightened the cardboard with the precision of someone making a silk-sheeted bed, then picked up the teddy bear and gently wiped the dust from its matted fur with a maternal tenderness. That small pantomime of normalcy in this setting of utter desolation was more shocking than any cry of despair. He, who lived in a mansion with more rooms than people, who changed cars like he changed shoes, was witnessing the raw definition of abandonment, the memory of his own childhood. A ghost he kept under lock and key forced its way out. He remembered himself, a small boy at an expensive boarding school, staring out the window at families strolling in the park. His parents had sent him there not for lack of money, but for lack of time, of space in their busy lives. He'd had a warm bed, food on the table, but the loneliness was the same as what emanated from that small figure in the alley. It was a cold that came from within, one no blanket could warm. Guilt, once a nagging ember, flared into a flame that burned his chest. His mockery in the garage hadn't just been cruel, it had been a desecration. He had mocked a survivor, a child who faced a daily reality he couldn't endure for an hour. As he wrestled with these thoughts, a burly man in a stained apron emerged from the other end of the alley. It was the owner of the corner bakery. Arthur vaguely recognized him. The man strode forward, his face twisted into a scowl. "Hey, you!" he shouted, his voice echoing unpleasantly between the brick walls. "I thought I told you not to come back here, you little thief." The girl shrank back, hugging the teddy bear to her chest. She didn't answer, just watched him with those large, frightened eyes. You took 2 loaves of bread yesterday. Think I didn't see you?" the baker continued, advancing on her menacingly. "Your kind only learns one way." He raised his hand, and Arthur felt his blood run cold. Instinct, faster than thought, made him step forward, out of the shadows and into the alley's faint light. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet but laced with a thread of steel that made the baker stop and turn. The man's eyes widened at the sight of the imposing, well-dressed figure. "What do you want here? This ain't no place for your type." Arthur ignored the question. "How much were the loaves she took?" he asked, his voice controlled, almost a whisper. The baker, taken aback, stammered, "Well, it's not about the money, it's the principle. She has to learn." "How much?" Arthur repeated, this time with a chill that cut the air. He pulled out his wallet again, but this time the gesture had a different purpose. It wasn't to get rid of a problem, but to solve one. The baker, intimidated, mumbled a price. Arthur pulled out a bill worth many times more and held it out. "This covers yesterday's bread, today's, and all of next month's. Leave her alone." The man snatched the money, his eyes wide, and shuffled away muttering, casting one last confused look at the scene. The alley fell silent again. Arthur turned to the girl. She was still watching him. The bear pressed tightly against her. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by a deep wariness. He was a stranger, a man who had humiliated her and now defended her. She didn't know how to react, and neither did he. He crouched down slowly so as not to frighten her, keeping a safe distance. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he remembered using in years. She hesitated for a long moment, her small lips trembling. Finally, the answer came, as faint as the rustle of dry leaves. "Lena, Lena," he repeated, the name feeling both strange and terribly important. He wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. What do you say to a child who has fixed your soul as much as your car, and to whom you offered nothing but cruelty? "You can't stay here, Lena," he finally said, the sentence sounding inadequate and obvious. She didn't answer, just hugged the bear tighter. In that moment, he understood that money wouldn't solve this. Shielding Lena from local shopkeepers was just the beginning. She needed more than bread. She needed a safe place, legal protection, someone to fight for her. And the universe, in its biting irony, seemed to be pointing directly at him. The man who had sworn never to get involved, never to care again. Arthur's decision wasn't a bolt of moral inspiration, but a slow, reluctant acceptance of the inevitable. Looking at Lena, huddled in her cardboard refuge, was like staring into a distorted mirror of his own failings. Leaving her there wouldn't just be an act of indifference. It would be an admission of his own cowardice. He had no idea what he was doing, acting purely on an impulse his business logic would deem irrational and inefficient. "Come with me," he said, the words sounding more like a command than an invitation. He cursed himself internally. He didn't know how to talk to children, especially one he had terrified. Lena didn't move. Her large, wary eyes studied him, weighing his intentions. To her, he was a contradiction, the aggressor and the protector, the monster and the savior. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture of frustration. He needed a different approach. "Look, Lena, you helped me. Now I want to help you." The words sounded hollow, a cliché from a bad movie. He tried again, searching for an honesty he hadn't used in years. "I was cruel to you. What I said in the garage was wrong. No one should have laughed at you." The mention of the garage made something shift in her face. A shadow of pain crossed her eyes, the first clear emotion he had seen in her besides fear and seriousness. It was that vulnerability that finally gave him the key. He didn't need to be a hero, he just needed to be human. He sat down on the filthy alley floor, a few feet from her, ignoring the crease in his $1,000 pants. The gesture surprised her. He was no longer towering over her, but putting himself on her level. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, and the confession felt surprisingly light. "But I know you can't stay here. It's dangerous." He waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant noises of the city. Finally, with a heartbreaking hesitation, Lena gave a small nod. It was enough. The journey from the alley to his car was an exercise in strangeness. People on the streets stared at the unlikely pair, the impeccably dressed man and the dirty, barefoot girl who held his hand with the grip of someone clinging to a life raft. He placed her in the passenger seat of the Mercedes, the cream leather contrasting painfully with her ragged clothes. She sat on the very edge of the seat, tense, as if afraid she would contaminate the luxury with her mere presence. He drove aimlessly for a while, his mind racing. What the hell was he doing? Take her to an orphanage, a shelter. The thought of handing her over to a faceless institution after pulling her from that alley felt like a betrayal. As the car slid silently through the streets, he made a call. "Helena, I need a favor. It's complicated." Helena was his lawyer, a pragmatic and efficient woman, the only person who could tolerate his temper. He explained the situation concisely, omitting his own shameful role at the beginning of the story. Helena listened in silence, and when he finished, she let out a long sigh. "Arthur, you can't just pick up a child off the street. There are procedures, laws. This could be interpreted as kidnapping." "I didn't kidnap her. I'm helping her," he retorted, his irritation returning. "She was being threatened." What was I supposed to do? Call the cops and let her be taken to some overcrowded shelter? "Yes, Arthur, that is exactly what a normal person would do," Helena said, with the patience of someone explaining the obvious. "But you're not normal." "All right, do this. Take her somewhere safe and neutral. A hotel, get her food, clean clothes. I'll start checking the official channels. See if there's a record of her, any relatives." "But Arthur," her voice turned serious, "don't get attached. You're doing a good deed, but she is not your long-term responsibility." Helena's words were sensible, logical. They were what he himself would say to any of his executives. But as he glanced to his side, at the girl staring out the window with quiet fascination, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, he felt a knot form in his throat. Long-term. What did that even mean? He'd spent his whole life planning the long term for his businesses. But for people, his horizon never extended beyond the next contract. He knew Helena was right. Getting involved was a risk, a complication he didn't need. But for the first time in a long time, the logical path didn't feel like the right one. He pulled up in front of a children's clothing store, and before getting out of the car, a question that had been nagging him since the garage finally escaped. "Lena, how did you know? How did you know what to do with the car?" She turned to him, and a fleeting glimmer, the first he had seen, lit up her eyes. "My dad taught me," she said, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "He was the best mechanic in the world." Lena's revelation about her father hung in the car's air, heavy with a weight Arthur hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just an innate skill, it was a legacy, an inheritance of love and knowledge passed from father to daughter. The image of a man patiently teaching a child the secrets of an engine contrasted starkly with his own paternal memories, silent dinners, school reports signed without a glance, and the constant feeling that he was just another investment to be managed. The clothing store was a world of color and texture that seemed to intimidate Lena. She walked between the racks with her hands behind her back, afraid to touch anything. Arthur, accustomed to buying clothes for his daughter Clara in exclusive boutiques, felt completely lost. He didn't know her size, her favorite colors, anything. A helpful saleswoman approached, her professional smile faltering slightly as she took in Lena's appearance. "Can I help you, sir?" Arthur gestured awkwardly. "She needs everything." It was a surreal afternoon. He watched from an uncomfortable distance as the saleswoman guided Lena through the store. He saw the girl touch a blue cotton dress with a hesitant reverence, as if it were a treasure. He saw her try on a new pair of shoes and take a few tentative steps, the astonishment on her face at feeling comfort beneath her feet for the first time in a long time. For every item Lena chose hesitantly, Arthur had the saleswoman grab 3 more in different colors. It was the only way he knew how to show care, with excess, with abundance, as if quantity could make up for emotional clumsiness. Later, at a quiet restaurant, he watched her eat with a ravenous hunger, but with impeccable manners. She didn't speak, but her eyes absorbed everything, from the way the silverware was arranged to the way other patrons conversed. It was like watching a small bird that, after a long storm, had finally found a safe place to land. As she ate, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his ex-wife, Valeria. "Clara's asking why you didn't call again." The message was a punch to the gut. He had completely forgotten, focused on Lena. He had neglected, once again, his own daughter. The irony was savage. Here he was, trying to be a savior to a strange child while failing miserably with his own. Guilt enveloped him like a heavy cloak. He looked at Lena, now eating her dessert with a quiet joy, and then at the text on his phone. 2 girls, 2 worlds. And he was in the middle, a failure in both. Helena's call came as he was paying the hotel bill. "Arthur, I have news and it's not good," she said, her tone brisk. "There are no missing person reports for Alina matching the description. No alerts, no complaints. Officially, she doesn't exist, which is worrying, but the worst news is about her father." Arthur felt his heart tighten. What about him? His name was Miguel Alves, and yes, he was a brilliant mechanic, highly respected in the city, but he didn't pass away prematurely. As you put it, he disappeared about 6 months ago, abandoned his daughter, and vanished without a trace. Arthur was silent, processing the information. Abandoned. The word echoed in his mind, cold and cruel. Lena wasn't an orphan in the traditional sense. She was a child her own father had left behind. The pain of that revelation was something he knew intimately. "There's more," Helena continued, her voice tense. "Your name, Arthur, is starting to get around. The story of the miracle at the garage has spread. And with it, the part about your joke. Valeria called me a little while ago. She heard from a friend. She's furious. She thinks you publicly humiliated a child and are now trying to clean up your image with this Good Samaritan act. And she plans to use it against you at the next custody hearing." The floor seemed to drop out from under him. His clumsy attempt to do the right thing had twisted into a weapon that would be used to push him even further from his own daughter. He hung up the phone, the dial tone buzzing in his head. He looked through the door of the hotel room where Lena, dressed in new pajamas, was sitting on the bed, flipping through a picture book he'd bought her. the very picture of innocence. She was safe, clean and fed, but he had dragged her into the center of his own personal hurricane. His life, which he had always kept so compartmentalized and controlled, was now irrevocably tangled with that of a girl who fixed cars and who, without knowing it, was about to take his own life apart, piece by piece. The night in the luxury hotel was a silent torture. Arthur barely slept, haunted by the demons of his past and the complications of his present. Valeria's accusation echoed in his mind, each word a blow to his already bruised pride. He, who saw himself as a master strategist, had made the most amateur of mistakes, underestimating the consequences of his actions. The next morning, a new sense of urgency drove him. He was no longer just helping a child. He was fighting for his own reputation and, perhaps, his last chance at reconnecting with his daughter, Clara. When he entered Lena's room after a brief breakfast, he found the bed made with military precision and the girl sitting in a chair by the window, watching the city move below. She was already dressed in her new clothes, but clutched the worn-out teddy bear like an anchor to her old world. "Good morning, Lena," he said, his voice gentler than he intended. "Did you sleep well?" She just nodded, her eyes still fixed on the urban landscape. He felt the distance between them, a chasm he didn't know how to cross. Helena's information about her father weighed on his conscience. Telling her that the man she idolized had abandoned her felt like a needless cruelty. For now, he would keep that secret. Helena's call interrupted his thoughts. "Arthur, we have a problem, bigger than Valeria," she said, her voice tight. "Some of the shopkeepers Lena stole from, well, they weren't satisfied with your payment. They figured she was being protected by a rich man and saw an opportunity. They're threatening to go to the police to charge her with petty theft unless they receive a more significant compensation." "That's extortion," Arthur snarled, fury rising in his chest. "Of course it is, but the threat is real. A police record, even a juvenile one, would massively complicate any attempt to regularize her situation. They know that." Arthur felt cornered. Every step he took to help Lena seemed to trigger a new trap. He looked at the girl, so small and oblivious to the storm gathering around her. The thought of her in a police station, scared and confused, was unbearable. "Pay them, Helena. Pay them whatever they want. Just make it go away." "I expected you to say that, but there's something else, Arthur. Someone from social services called me. A neighbor from the garage filed an anonymous report about the incident. They want to talk to you. They want to know who the girl is and why she's in your care." The knot in his stomach tightened. The state was getting involved. From now on, his actions would be scrutinized. He was no longer just a rich man trying to do the right thing. He was a potentially unfit guardian with a problematic family history. As he was processing this new avalanche of problems, something outside the window caught Lena's eye. Her eyes widened, and she shot up, pressing her face against the glass. "What is it?" Arthur asked, following her gaze. On the street below, two rough-looking men stood by a black van, staring directly up at the hotel. One of them was the baker he had confronted in the alley. The other he didn't recognize, but the look on his face was predatory. They didn't look like they were waiting for a payout. They looked like they were waiting for Lena. A chill ran down Arthur's spine. This wasn't about money anymore. They had figured out her connection to him, and now she was no longer just a bread thief, but the link to a much more lucrative target. Arthur's phone rang again, an unknown number this time. He answered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Mr. Montenegro," a gravelly voice said on the other end. "We think your new little friend owes us more than a few bucks, and we think you're going to want to pay her debt for her sake." Before Arthur could respond, the hotel room door burst open. It wasn't the men from the street. It was Valeria, his ex-wife, her face a mask of cold fury. And behind her, standing in the hallway, was their daughter, Clara, her eyes wide with shock and confusion, staring at the unknown girl in her father's room. Arthur's world had just imploded, trapped between blackmailers on the street, his furious ex-wife at the door, and social services on the phone. He looked at Lena, the child he was supposed to save, who had instead become the epicenter of his ruin. And in that moment of absolute chaos, Lena did the only thing she could. She ran. She darted past Valeria and Clara like a flash, disappearing down the hotel corridor, back into the dangerous world he had tried and failed to pull her from. The hotel corridor was suddenly silent, save for the hollow sound of Lena's fading, frantic footsteps. For a paralyzing second, no one moved. Valeria stood agape, her rage momentarily replaced by the shock of the girl's sudden flight. Clara, his daughter, stared at the empty space where the other girl had been, an unreadable expression on her face. Reality hit Arthur like a physical blow. Lena was out there, alone, terrified, and worst of all, being hunted. "Lena!" he yelled, desperation tearing through his voice. He bolted past Valeria, ignoring the "Arthur, get back here!" she flung at his back. He sprinted down the hall, the elevator doors closing too slowly. He took the stairs, bounding down 3 steps at a time, his heart pounding not just from exertion but from pure, primal fear. He had to find her. That was the only thing that mattered. The city, once his playground, now felt like a threatening labyrinth. He scoured the streets around the hotel, his expensive suit and distinct appearance drawing curious glances. He shouted her name, the sound lost in the cacophony of traffic and conversation. Every dark-haired child he saw made his heart leap, only to be followed by bitter disappointment. She had vanished, swallowed by the metropolis as if she had never existed. The frantic search lasted for hours, until the afternoon sun began to dip, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to mock his anguish. Exhausted, defeated, he finally stopped, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. Where would she have gone? He tried to think like her, scared, alone. She would go back to the only place she knew as home, the alley. He ran, hope, fragile and faint, re-emerging in his chest, but the alley was empty. The piece of cardboard was still there, as was the one-eyed teddy bear, now lying face down in the dirt like a small casualty of the tragedy. The sight of the abandoned toy was more devastating than anything else. It meant she had left in such a hurry she'd left behind her only companion. He sank onto the filthy ground, the same spot he'd sat the day before to earn her trust, and the loneliness enveloped him. It wasn't just the loneliness of being alone, it was the crushing loneliness of failure. He had failed her, just as he had failed Clara. Failed Valeria, failed everyone who had ever dared to get close to him. His phone vibrated in his pocket, the sound shrill in the alley's silence. It was Helena. "Arthur, where are you?" "Valeria is beside herself. Social services wants to schedule an urgent meeting, and the men who called, they called again. They're getting impatient." "I can't find her, Helena," he said, his voice cracking. "She ran. I lost her." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Helena spoke again, her tone was softer, stripped of its usual professional efficiency. "Arthur, you need to calm down. Use your head. You're a man of resources. If anyone can find her, it's you. Hire private investigators. Call in your contacts. Don't give in to panic." Her words, though practical, sounded distant. Resources, contacts, money. The tools he had always used to solve everything felt coarse and inadequate to fix what was now broken. He was about to hang up when he heard a noise from the back of the alley, a small scuffling sound like loose gravel shifting. He stood up, his heart leaping. "Lena!" No answer. He walked slowly toward the darkness, his heart in his throat. From behind the dumpster, huddled in a small cavity in the wall he hadn't noticed before, a figure emerged. But it wasn't Lena. It was Sal, the owner of the garage. The man got to his feet, brushing dust from his pants. His face creased with worry. "Mr. Montenegro, I figured you'd end up here." "Sal, what are you doing here? Have you seen her?" Sal shook his head. "No, sir, not since she fixed your car. But I've heard things. The story got around, and I knew her father, Miguel. He was my friend." Arthur stared at him, hope mixing with confusion. "You knew him?" "Yeah, Miguel was a genius, but a troubled man. Had debts, got mixed up with the wrong people. That's why he disappeared. Not because he wanted to leave his kid, but because he thought he was protecting her." The revelation hit Arthur with the force of a wave. Miguel wasn't a deadbeat dad. He was a desperate man, making a terrible choice in an attempt to save his daughter. A choice that, ironically, had left her even more vulnerable. "Those men who are looking for her," Sal continued, his voice low, "they're the same ones Miguel owed money to. They don't want the girl. They think Miguel left something valuable with her." Arthur frowned. "Something valuable? Like what?" "I don't know. But Miguel was always talking about his projects. Notebooks filled with ideas, inventions. Said they'd change the world one day. Maybe that's what they're after." Suddenly, the image of Lena in the garage, her hand moving with certainty and knowledge, made sense. She hadn't just learned from her father. She was the keeper of his legacy, and now that legacy had put her in mortal danger. Sal's revelation changed the entire board. Lena wasn't just an innocent victim. She was the holder of a secret, the key to something dangerous men coveted. The search for her was no longer just a matter of personal redemption for Arthur. It was now a race against time to protect her from a very real threat. "Where would they be?" Arthur asked, his mind already working, formulating strategies. These men, where would Miguel have met them? Sal hesitated, his expression uneasy. Miguel had a place, an old garage out back of the industrial district. It's where he worked on his secret projects, away from prying eyes. If he hid anything, it'd be there. And if those guys know anything, that's where they'd go. Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline. It was a lead, a direction. He thanked Sal, promised to be in touch, and raced back to his car. As he sped toward the city's gritty underbelly, he called Helena. "Forget the PIS, I need security, the best you can find. Meet me at the old Alves garage in the industrial district. And Helena, be discreet." He didn't wait for a reply, hanging up the phone. This time, he wasn't acting like a worried father, but like the ruthless businessman he was. He was in his element, moving pieces, anticipating his opponent's moves. The industrial district was a landscape of rust and concrete, a graveyard of industrial dreams. Miguel's garage was a small brick building, squeezed between a derelict warehouse and a junkyard. The metal roll-up door was down, but a side window was broken, offering a way in. Arthur parked a safe distance away and approached on foot, his heart pounding. He didn't know what he expected to find inside. Violence, a trap. He peered through the broken window, and what he saw took his breath away. The garage interior wasn't dark and abandoned. A single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling illuminated the scene, and in the center of the space, her back to him, was Lena. She didn't look scared. She was focused, working on an old engine block mounted on a stand. Her small hands moved with the same mesmerizing precision he'd seen in the garage, cleaning, adjusting, connecting parts. Around her, the walls were covered in complex diagrams, formulas, and technical drawings, all scrawled in chalk. The place wasn't a hideout, it was a sanctuary. Miguel's legacy was everywhere. Arthur felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly buckled his knees. She was safe, but the relief was short-lived. He heard the sound of a car approaching, its headlights sweeping the alley. It was them. He had to get her out of there. Now. He went around and forced the front door, which groaned open. "Lena," he whispered urgently. She spun around, her eyes widening in surprise, but not fear. A wrench was in her hand. "You have to get out of here. They're coming." She didn't argue. The trust he had fought so hard to win seemed to solidify in that instant. She grabbed a small canvas backpack from a corner and ran to him. Just as they reached the back door, the front door burst open with a crash. It was the two men, the same ones from outside the hotel. "Well, well, what do we have here?" the bigger one said, an ugly smile on his face. "The millionaire and the little grease monkey. Hand over the notebooks, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here." Lena shrank behind Arthur, clutching the backpack tightly. Arthur stood protectively in front of her. His mind raced, searching for an out, an angle. There was none. They were cornered. "I don't know what you're talking about," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. The man laughed. "Don't play dumb. We know Miguel left the designs with her. They're worth a fortune." He took a step forward, and his partner circled to the side, cutting off any escape. It was then that Arthur noticed it. Behind the men in the garage entrance, a new figure appeared, silhouetted against the streetlights. For a second, he thought it was Helena's security, but the figure was female. It was Valeria, and beside her, her face pale and her eyes wide, was Clara. They had followed him. Valeria must have put a tracker on his car, a paranoid tactic from their litigious divorce days. Arthur's heart sank. He had led the danger not only to himself and Lena, but to his own family. The situation had escalated from terrible to catastrophic. The presence of Valeria and Clara transformed the tense atmosphere into a powder keg. The two men glanced at the newcomers, a cruel glimmer of opportunity in their eyes. More hostages, more leverage. Valeria, for her part, was pale with shock, the fury that had driven her here evaporating in the face of real physical threat. She grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her back, the protective lioness emerging through her panic. Clara, however, didn't seem terrified. Her eyes were locked on Lena, the girl huddled behind her father. There was a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and something else, something Arthur couldn't decipher, in her gaze. "Well, look at this, a family reunion," the bigger man sneered, savoring the moment. "This just makes things easier." The backpack kid. Now, Arthur knew a physical confrontation was impossible. He was outnumbered and outmatched. He had to use his only weapon, his mind. He had to negotiate, to buy time. "All right, calm down," he said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "You want the designs. They're in the pack, but you don't know what to do with them. They're just scribbles to you. I, on the other hand, I can turn them into millions." The second, quieter man snickered. "And why should we trust you?" "Because I'm Arthur Montenegro," he said, injecting every ounce of arrogance and authority he could muster into his name. "Now, I didn't build an empire by making bad deals. You give me the girl and my family. In return, I develop the projects, and I cut you in 50%. That's a better offer than you'll get selling old papers on the black market." It was a bluff, but a calculated one. He was speaking their language, greed. He saw hesitation in the leader's eyes. The seed of doubt was planted. As Arthur held their attention, he noticed a subtle movement. Lena, still hidden behind him, was fiddling with something on the engine stand. Her fingers moved quickly, connecting a wire here, twisting a valve there. What was she doing? The burly man seemed to make a decision. "I like your nerve, Montenegro, but I prefer the simple approach. We take the backpack and we disappear. And to make sure you don't call the cops, maybe your pretty daughter comes with us for a while." The icy fear returned with a vengeance. He had failed. The bluff hadn't worked. The man took a step toward Clara. Valeria let out a strangled cry. It was at that exact moment that Lena stood up. "No!" she yelled, her voice surprisingly strong. She was holding two thick cables, their stripped ends dangerously close. With a swift movement, she touched them to a terminal on the battery connected to the engine. A bright blue spark leaped, and the old engine, which looked like it had been dead for decades, roared to life with a deafening clamor. The sound was so unexpected and violent, it made everyone jump. But that wasn't all. The engine began to shake violently on its stand, and a thick cloud of black, oily smoke poured from its exhaust, rapidly filling the garage. "Run!" Arthur yelled, seizing the moment of confusion. He grabbed Lena's hand and pulled Valeria and Clara toward the back door. The two men, coughing and eyes streaming, were momentarily disoriented in the thick smoke. They burst out into the cool night air, scrambling down the back alley. Behind them, they heard the men shouting in rage and frustration. They reached Arthur's car, breathless, hearts hammering. He bundled them inside, got behind the wheel, and floored it, the tires screaming on the pavement. In the rearview mirror, he saw the garage shrouded in smoke, a chaotic scene of their making. He had escaped, but the problem was far from over. Now, the four of them were in a car together, running from dangerous men. Valeria was in shock, Clara was trembling silently in the back, and Lena, the small hero, clutched her backpack as if her life depended on it. The family he had shattered was reunited in the most unlikely and dangerous way possible, bound together not by love, but by fear. And he, the man who always had all the answers, had no idea what to do next. The security Helena had hired arrived too late, finding only an empty, smoke-filled garage, a silent testament to the drama that had just unfolded. The silence inside the Mercedes was heavier than the smoke they had left behind. Arthur drove with no destination, the city lights blurring past. Beside him, Valeria finally found her voice, but it was a trembling whisper, devoid of its usual fury. What was that, Arthur? Who were those men? In the back seat, Clara was huddled in one corner, as far as she could get from Lena, who was at the other end, clutching her backpack. The tension between the two girls was an invisible electric current, charged with years of resentment from one side and a lifetime of loneliness from the other. "It's a long story," Arthur answered, the phrase sounding absurdly inadequate. He knew he owed them an explanation, not just Valeria, but himself. How had his life come to this? He searched for a safe place, a sanctuary. His mansion was out of the question. It would be the first place the men would look. He considered hotels, but the memory of Lena's flight was too fresh. Finally, a memory surfaced. A mountain house he kept, a place no one, not even Valeria, knew he still owned. It was his private sanctuary, the place he escaped to when the weight of his empire became too much. It was the perfect place. The drive was long and silent. By the time they arrived, dawn was painting the sky gray. The house was a modern structure of wood and glass, nestled among tall pines, overlooking a misty valley. It was a place of peace, a stark contrast to the chaos of their lives. Inside, exhaustion finally overcame them. Valeria took Clara to one of the guest rooms, and Arthur showed Lena where she could stay. Before closing her door, he turned to the girl. "Lena, what you did back there, that was incredible. You saved all of us." She just looked up at him, her eyes large and serious, and gave a small nod before shutting the door. He was left alone in the vast living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a profound weariness and a painful clarity. He saw his life stripped of all its successful trappings, the money, the power, the reputation. What was left was a man who had broken his family and endangered another child. Valeria appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a robe. "Clara's asleep," she said quietly. "Now you're going to tell me everything, Arthur. No more lies." And so he did. He told her about the afternoon in the garage, the humiliation, the cruel joke. He told her about the alley, the baker, the discovery of Lena's life on the streets. He told her about Miguel, the debts, the designs in the backpack. He spared himself nothing, laying bare his arrogance, his carelessness, his guilt. Valeria listened in silence, her face unreadable. When he finished, she didn't scream. She didn't accuse him. Instead, she did something he never expected. She came over, sat beside him on the sofa, and said, You were an idiot, Arthur, a complete idiot. But you tried to fix it. In your own clumsy, arrogant way, you tried to do the right thing. Her words, a mixture of indictment and reluctant compassion, disarmed him completely. He felt the barriers he had built over the years begin to crumble. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't the CEO, the titan, the master of the universe. He was just a man, flawed and afraid. "I don't know what to do, Val," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I put her in danger. I put all of you in danger. We'll figure it out," she said. And in that, "we" was the promise of an alliance he thought he had lost forever. The next morning, a new challenge arose, not from outside, but from within the house. Clara emerged from her room, her face swollen from crying, and confronted her father. "Why her?" she asked, her voice trembling with a pain that was more than just jealousy. "Why are you doing all this for her? You never did anything like this for me." The accusation hung in the air, brutal and true. Arthur had no answer. How could he explain that helping Lena was his twisted way of trying to atone for failing her, his own daughter? It was Lena who broke the silence. She came out of her room, clutching the backpack. She walked over to Clara, one girl looking at the other. "Your father didn't do this for me," Lena said, her voice clear and steady. "He did this for himself." Then she opened the backpack. Inside, there weren't just notebooks, but also a small wooden box. She opened it, revealing a collection of old, faded photographs. In one, a young man was smiling, his arm around a woman. The man was unmistakably Miguel, and next to him, smiling too, was a much younger Arthur Montenegro. The two men weren't just acquaintances, they were friends, and in another photo, the young Arthur was holding a baby who, according to the date written on the back, was born around the same time as Clara. The photograph slipped from Valeria's hands, fluttering silently to the rug. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Arthur stared at the image, at his younger self, and the dam of memories he had so painstakingly built burst, flooding him with a past he had tried to drown. Miguel Alves wasn't just a mechanic, he had been his first and only true friend. They had met in college, two young men from different worlds, united by a passion for creating, for building. Arthur, with his mind for business, Miguel, with his genius hands. Together, they dreamed of starting a company that would revolutionize the automotive industry. Montenegro Motors wasn't born just from Arthur's capital, but from Miguel's ideas and prototypes. "What does this mean, Arthur?" Valeria's voice was a thread, fragile and dangerous. He couldn't tear his eyes from the photo. He remembered the day it was taken, Clara's birth. Miguel had been there, at the hospital, more nervous than Arthur himself, holding his newborn goddaughter with reverent care. He was Clara's godfather, a fact Arthur had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself it never happened. The betrayal hadn't been Miguel's, it had been his. As the company grew, Arthur's ambition grew with it. He became obsessed with profits, with expansion. Miguel's innovative ideas, once the soul of the company, became unnecessary risks. Arthur began to marginalize his friend, making decisions without consulting him, turning their partnership into a dictatorship. The final straw was when Arthur, in a hostile maneuver, bought out Miguel's share of the company for a fraction of its real worth, using a contractual clause that Miguel, in his blind trust, had never read closely. He had destroyed his friend to build his empire. "He worked for you," Valeria whispered, putting the pieces together. "No," Arthur answered, his voice raw with shame. "He worked with me. I forced him out. I betrayed him." The revelation hung in the room, horrific and irrefutable. His cruelty to Lena in the garage hadn't been a random act of arrogance. It was the echo of a much deeper betrayal. a contempt for the legacy of the man he had cast aside. Lena, with a calmness that belied the bomb she had just detonated, picked up another photo. "My father told me everything," she said, her voice firm. "He didn't abandon me. He went to find an investor for his new projects, the ones you refused to fund. He was coming back for me. He promised." She looked directly at Clara. "Your father, he humiliated me. But he also saved me, and I know why. Because when he looks at me, he sees what he lost. He didn't save me for my sake. He saved me because of my father." Clara's silence was broken by a sob. The anger on her face gave way to a painful understanding. This wasn't about a strange girl stealing her father. It was about a ghost from the past that had returned to haunt them all. The tension in the room had reached its peak. All the lies, all the half-truths were exposed in the cold morning light. It was the moment of truth, the turning point that would define all their futures. Arthur's phone rang, the sharp sound cutting through the charged atmosphere. It was Helena. "Arthur, bad news. The social worker, a Ms. Davis, has secured an emergency hearing. It's for this afternoon. She's petitioning for temporary state custody of Lena, and she's going to use everything against you. The incident at the garage, your history with Valeria, the girl's disappearance from the hotel. She's building a case that you're a danger to the child." Arthur felt the last pillar of his world crumble. He was about to lose Lena, the last living connection to the man he had betrayed. The only chance he had to repair a fraction of the damage he'd caused. The hearing wouldn't just be about Lena's custody. It would be a trial of his entire life. All his failures as a father, a husband, a friend, would be dissected in a courtroom. And the key witness against him, the person whose testimony could seal his fate, wouldn't be Valeria or the social worker. It would be his own daughter, Clara, the girl he had neglected for years, whose pain he now understood in all its depth. She would be asked what kind of father he was, and Arthur knew with a crushing certainty that there was nothing he could say to deserve her forgiveness. Her honest, painful answer would decide everything. The courtroom was small and austere, the air heavy with the formality of the law. Arthur felt like a stranger in his own suit, a useless armor against the scrutiny in the eyes of the judge and Ms. Davis, the social worker, whose face was a mask of professional disapproval. Valeria sat a row behind him, her posture tense but supportive. Lena sat beside a court-appointed advocate, small and serious in her new dress, her eyes fixed on Arthur, not with accusation, but with a quiet expectation. The hearing began, and it was as brutal as Arthur had expected. Miss Davis presented her case with cold efficiency, painting a devastating portrait of Arthur, an unstable, arrogant, and emotionally negligent man. The garage episode was recounted in humiliating detail. His tumultuous relationship with Valeria and his estrangement from Clara were presented as proof of his parental unfitness. Lena's flight from the hotel and the confrontation in the industrial district were described as the climax of a series of reckless decisions that had endangered the child. Arthur listened to it all in silence, not contesting a word. Every statement, though spoken by a stranger, was the truth. He was all those things. When it was his turn to speak, he rose, but not to defend himself. He looked directly at the judge, a woman with graying hair and a penetrating gaze. "Your Honor, nearly everything Ms. Davis has said is true," he began, his voice steady but stripped of its usual arrogance. "I have been arrogant, I have been negligent, and my actions, however well-intentioned they may have become, did put Lena in danger." A murmur went through the room. Valeria held her breath. "But what hasn't been said here," Arthur continued, "is the reason for all of this, the truth about my relationship with Lena's father, Miguel Alves." He then told the story of their friendship, their partnership, their betrayal. He spared himself nothing, confessing to his greed and how he destroyed the man who was his best friend and his daughter's godfather. "And I am not trying to adopt Lena to clear my conscience," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I know that's impossible. I am doing this because it's the only thing I can do to honor her father's memory, to give her the life he dreamed of. A life I stopped him from building. It is my debt, a debt I can never fully repay, but one I will spend the rest of my life trying to." He sat down, his heart exposed, his soul laid bare. The silence in the room was profound. The judge looked down at her papers, her face unreadable. "Mrs. Montenegro," the judge said, addressing Valeria, "what is your position on Mr. Montenegro's fitness to care for this child?" Valeria stood. "Your Honor, for years I believed Arthur was incapable of putting anyone before himself, but in the last few weeks, I've seen a change in him, a painful, reluctant, but genuine change. I've seen him scared. I've seen him remorseful. I've seen him try. I believe Lena is not a burden to him. She is his chance to become the man he should have been a long time ago." Finally, the judge turned to the most important figure in the room. "Clara Montenegro, please approach." Clara walked slowly to the front, her face pale. She looked at her father, at Lena, and then to the judge. "Ms. Davis believes the attention your father is giving Lena could be detrimental to you," the judge said gently. "She believes he isn't capable of being a father to 2 children. What are your thoughts on that?" The room held its breath. Everyone's future rested in the hands of a hurt teenager. Clara looked at her father, and Arthur saw in her eyes the pain of years of broken promises. He braced himself for the verdict, for the condemnation he knew he deserved. "My dad, he hasn't been a good father to me," Clara began, her voice shaky but clear. "He's missed birthdays, school plays, dinners. He always chose work." But she took a deep breath. "For the past few days, I've watched my dad fight for someone, not with money, but with his heart. I've seen him truly scared for Lena's safety. He wasn't thinking about business. He was thinking about her." She turned and looked at Lena. "I was jealous, so angry. But then I understood. Lena didn't steal my father from me. She's giving him back, the man I saw at the mountain house, the man who confessed his mistakes today. That's the dad I've always wanted. If he can be that dad for her, then maybe he can finally learn how to be that dad for me, too." A single, silent tear traced a path down Arthur's cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but of a gratitude so overwhelming it hurt. His daughter hadn't condemned him. She had offered him the most precious thing of all, hope. The judge watched the scene, and a faint smile touched her lips. She brought down her gavel. "Temporary custody is granted to Arthur Montenegro, under the strict supervision of social services. A reassessment will be conducted in 6 months. The sound of the gavel echoed like a beginning, not an end. The immediate legal battle was won, but the emotional journey to rebuild their family was just starting. 6 months later, the Thursday air was light and crisp, carrying the scent of clean grease and the promise of a new start. Sal's auto and repair was no longer the same. The dark, cramped space had been transformed into a bright, modern training facility, the Miguel Alves Mechanical Institute. Arthur, wearing a clean set of coveralls with the institute's logo, watched the scene with a contentment no multi-million-dollar deal had ever given him. In the center of the garage, Lena, now 9, and with a confident gleam in her eyes, stood on a small platform, patiently explaining the workings of an electronic fuel injection system to a group of attentive teenagers, underprivileged youth on full scholarships. Her ability to translate complex concepts into simple language was a gift, a clear echo of her father's talent. Beside her, Clara, a clipboard in hand, helped pass out tools and answer questions. The former barrier between the two girls replaced by a sisterly bond. She had found her own talent, not in mechanics, but in organizing and caring for the other students, becoming the institute's project manager. Valeria, sitting on a nearby bench, was chatting with Miss Davis. The social worker, once an adversary, was now a partner, visiting the institute regularly, not to supervise, but to admire the progress. Valeria and Arthur's relationship had also transformed. They hadn't rekindled their marriage, but they had built a new partnership based on mutual respect and the shared goal of raising their daughters. They were a family, redefined and stronger than before. Arthur felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Sal, who now served as the institute's head instructor. "He'd be proud, Arthur," the old mechanic said, nodding toward Lena. "Of both of you." Arthur nodded, a lump in his throat. He knew complete redemption was impossible, but making amends was a daily journey. Miguel's designs, from Lena's backpack, had become the institute's core curriculum. With Arthur's investment, the innovations that might have enriched one company were now being used to educate and empower dozens of young people, creating opportunities that would change their lives. The men who had threatened them had been arrested, thanks to an anonymous tip from Sal, who had finally found the courage to confront the ghosts of his friends' past. Lena's adoption was official. She was, legally and in every other sense, Arthur's daughter. More importantly, she and Clara were undeniably sisters. Later that day, the family gathered at the mountain house, the place that symbolized both their chaos and their healing. They sat on the deck, watching the sunset paint the valley in warm colors. Clara rested her head on Arthur's shoulder, a simple gesture that held a universe of forgiveness. On his other side, Lena snuggled close, feeling, perhaps for the first time in her life, completely safe. Arthur Montenegro, the man who once measured his worth in bank digits and corporate takeovers, now understood that true wealth wasn't in what you owned, but in where you belonged. He looked at the faces of his two daughters, the legacy of a painful past and the promise of a bright future. He had learned the hard way that the most complex engines, the hardest ones to fix, aren't made of metal and wires, but of flesh, bone, and feeling. The garage, the site of his greatest humiliation, had become the symbol of his redemption. The cruel joke he'd made had become a sacred promise, and the barefoot girl he'd scorned had not only fixed his luxury car, she had taken apart his life of lies and helped him rebuild it on a stronger foundation, one of truth, love, and second chances. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had a family, and that was all that mattered.